Everyone at Meridian Aerospace laughed when 17-year-old Marcus Miller, wearing his father's oversized work boots and a faded flannel shirt, stepped forward during the executive board meeting, where million-dollar contracts were decided. CEO Victoria Sterling dared him to fix the $8 million prototype jet engine that had stumped her engineers for 3 weeks. With cameras rolling and the entire board watching, expecting the janitor's son to fail spectacularly and be permanently banned from the facility. But the moment Marcus calmly asked for a 7/16 wrench and mentioned checking the fuel injection timing, the engineers exchanged nervous glances. What happened next would expose 15 years of corporate fraud and transform a cafeteria worker's son into the engineer who destroyed Victoria Sterling's empire. Victoria Sterling stood at the head of the conference table like a general surveying her troops. Her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched the steel in her voice. She had built Meridian Aerospace from a small military supplier into a billion-dollar empire. And she hadn't done it by entertaining the fantasies of teenagers who probably couldn't tell a turbine from a turbocharger. Her gray eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of predatory focus that had crushed competitors and silenced board members for 2 decades. The other executives' men, who had learned to read her moods like weather patterns, leaned forward slightly, sensing entertainment approaching. "You think you can fix what my team of MIT graduates couldn't solve?" She asked, her voice carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for people she considered beneath notice. "My engineers have advanced degrees and decades of experience. What exactly makes you think you have something to contribute here?" Marcus stood quietly near the back of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, looking smaller than his 17 years against the imposing backdrop of corporate power. His father, Daniel, worked the overnight shift in the cafeteria downstairs, mopping floors and cleaning tables that these same executives would dirty tomorrow morning with their imported coffee and catered breakfast meetings. Marcus had been waiting for his dad to finish his shift when he'd heard the commotion from the emergency board meeting, the raised voices and frustrated cursing that had echoed down the hallway. He'd listened at the door as Victoria Sterling described the engine failure in technical terms that most people wouldn't understand. But Marcus understood every word. He understood because he'd been learning about turbine engines since he was old enough to hold a wrench, taught by someone who knew more about aerospace engineering than anyone in this room suspected. "I'd like to take a look at it," he said simply, his voice steady despite the weight of their stares. "If that's okay with you." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Victoria to consider her options. She could dismiss him outright. We sent him back to whatever menial task had brought him to the executive floor. But something about his quiet confidence irritated her in a way that demanded public correction. She had built her reputation on never backing down from a challenge. And she certainly wasn't going to start with a teenager whose father probably made minimum wage. The other board members sensed her decision before she spoke, their faces already arranging themselves into expressions of anticipatory amusement. "Fine," she said, her smile sharp as a blade. "I'll make you a deal. You fix our $8 million engine that has stumped a team of experts, and I'll personally write you a recommendation letter to any engineering school in the country. But when you fail, and you will fail, you and your father are both fired, permanently banned from this facility. How does that sound?" Marcus nodded once, a gesture so calm and matter-of-fact that several executives exchanged glances. They had expected stammering, maybe backing down. Certainly some sign that the kid understood the magnitude of what he was attempting. Instead, he simply asked, "When would you like me to start?" Victoria Sterling's eyes narrowed slightly. Unused to having her psychological pressure tactics met with such composure, she had expected to send him running back to his father with a lesson about knowing his place. But his steady gaze held something that made her suddenly want to crush him more thoroughly. "Right now," she said, gesturing toward the elevator. "The whole board will come down to watch. We'll record everything. Naturally, I want there to be no question about what happens when overconfidence meets reality." The hangar felt like stepping into a cathedral of American engineering. its soaring ceiling disappearing into shadows, while industrial lights cast harsh circles on the concrete floor. In the center sat the prototype engine, a masterpiece of titanium and steel that represented the cutting edge of military aviation technology. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its polished surfaces reflecting the overhead lights like a metallic sculpture of controlled power. 24 engineers in lab coats stood clustered around diagnostic equipment, their faces showing the exhaustion of 3 weeks spent chasing an intermittent fault that appeared and disappeared without pattern or logic. Their workshops were covered with schematics, computer printouts, and the detritus of systematic troubleshooting coffee cups, energy drink cans, and notebooks filled with calculations that had led nowhere. Victoria Sterling swept into the space like she owned it, which she did, her heels clicking against the concrete as the board members arranged themselves in a semicircle to observe the impending humiliation. Marcus walked slowly around the engine, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes taking in details that the assembled engineers had measured and documented, but perhaps not truly seen. He stopped at the intake assembly, crouched down to examine the alignment of the fan blades, then moved to the combustion chamber housing where sensors and monitoring equipment had been attached like electronic ivy. The silence in the hangar grew heavy as he continued his inspection, ignoring the whispered comments and barely suppressed laughter from the gallery of corporate executives. After several minutes, he straightened and walked to one of the engineers' workshops, studying the diagnostic readouts and fault logs that covered 3 computer monitors. "Has anyone checked the harmonic resonance in the third stage compressor?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly in the vast space. The lead engineer, Dr. Zara Mitchell, looked up from her laptop with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with barely concealed annoyance. "Of course we checked harmonic resonance," Dr. Mitchell replied, her tone suggesting that she was explaining something to a child. "We've run every diagnostic protocol in the manual, plus several we developed specifically for this engine. The resonance patterns are all within acceptable parameters." She gestured to a wall-mounted display showing waveforms and frequency analyses that look like abstract art to most observers. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, then asked if he could see the maintenance logs from the assembly process. The question itself was sophisticated enough that several engineers exchanged glances. Most people wouldn't know that maintenance logs existed, let alone understand their relevance to engine diagnostics. Dr. Mitchell handed him a thick binder with obvious reluctance, watching as he flipped through pages of technical entries and quality control checkmarks. After a few minutes, Marcus looked up with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "I think I know what's wrong," he said quietly. Victoria Sterling stepped forward, her patience clearly wearing thin. She had orchestrated this demonstration to provide a teachable moment about hubris and social hierarchy, not to watch some kid browse through paperwork like he belonged there. "Enough with the theatrics," she said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of cooling fans and electronic equipment. "Either you can fix it or you can't. My engineers don't have time to watch you pretend to understand concepts that took them years to master." The other board members nodded in agreement, their faces showing the particular kind of impatience that came from having their time wasted by social inferiors. Marcus closed the maintenance log and walked back to the engine, this time stopping at a panel on the side that housed the fuel injection system. "I'll need a 7/16 wrench and about 10 minutes, he said, looking directly at Victoria Sterling. "But first, I have a question. Do you remember Thomas Miller?" The name hit Victoria Sterling like a physical blow, her composed expression faltering for just a moment before professional control reasserted itself. But that momentary lapse was enough for Marcus to see recognition in her eyes, followed quickly by something that looked very much like fear. Thomas Miller had been the senior engineer on Meridian's military contracts 15 years ago. Before Victoria Sterling had orchestrated his dismissal on fabricated charges of corporate espionage, he had been the mind behind 3 breakthrough designs that had secured Meridian's position in the defense industry, innovations that had made Victoria Sterling rich and powerful. The official story was that he had been caught selling secrets to foreign competitors. But the real story was that he had discovered Victoria's practice of billing the government for research that had already been completed, essentially selling the same innovation multiple times when Thomas Miller had threatened to report the fraud. Victoria had destroyed his career and his reputation so thoroughly that no aerospace company would hire him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Marcus picked up the wrench from a nearby tool cart and began removing the access panel with practice efficiency. His movements were precise and confident, the actions of someone who had performed this exact procedure many times before. "Thomas Miller was my father's name," he said, without looking up from his work, "before he changed it to Daniel when he couldn't find engineering work anymore. Before he had to take a job cleaning your floors to support his family." The wrench slipped slightly in his hand, the only sign that this revelation cost him anything emotionally. "He taught me everything he knew about turbine engines, spending every evening after his janitorial shift showing me schematics and explaining principles that most people need engineering degrees to understand. He never stopped being an engineer. Even when you made sure he couldn't work as one, the access panel came free, revealing the complex web of fuel lines and injection nozzles that fed the engine's combustion chambers. The silence in the hangar was absolute, now broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the metallic sounds of Marcus working inside the engine housing. Dr. Mitchell had stopped pretending to review her diagnostics. Her attention focused entirely on the teenager who was performing maintenance procedures with a skill level that shouldn't have been possible. The other engineers crowded closer, their professional curiosity overcoming their initial skepticism as they watched Marcus disconnect and examine fuel injection components with the confidence of someone who had done this work for years. Victoria Sterling stood frozen, her mind racing through the implications of what she was hearing. If Thomas Miller was still alive, if he had been working as a janitor in her own building for years, then he had been in a position to observe her operations to gather evidence of the continuing fraud that had made her fortune. "You're lying," she said, but the words came out weak and unconvincing. Marcus held up a small component from inside the fuel system. A precision-machined part that looked perfect to untrained eyes but showed subtle signs of manufacturing defect under closer inspection. "The fuel injection timing is off by 3 milliseconds because this pressure regulator was installed backwards during assembly," he explained to the gathered engineers, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining a complex concept to students. "It's working within acceptable parameters most of the time. But under certain load conditions, it creates a feedback loop that cascades through the entire system. The engine shuts down as a safety measure, but the diagnostic systems can't identify the root cause because the timing error is too small to trigger the fault detection algorithms." He handed the component to Dr. Mitchell, who examined it with a magnifying glass and slowly nodded in confirmation. The defect was exactly as Marcus had described, subtle enough to escape routine inspection, but significant enough to cause systematic failure. Dr. Mitchell looked up from the component with an expression of grudging respect. "How did you know to look there?" she asked. "We've been through every system multiple times, and none of our diagnostic protocols flagged the fuel injection timing." Marcus was already reassembling the component in its correct orientation, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this exact repair before. "My father designed this engine," he said simply, "the original prototype. Before Meridian bought the design and made modifications, he told me that if there was ever a problem with intermittent shutdowns, the first thing to check would be the fuel injection timing. Because the tolerance margins were so tight that even minor installation errors could cause systematic failures, he tightened the final connection and replaced the access panel, then stepped back from the engine with quiet satisfaction. He also told me that corporate executives would probably try to cut costs by using cheaper injection regulators that looked identical but had slightly different specifications. Victoria Sterling felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as the full implications of Marcus's revelation became clear. If Thomas Miller had designed the original engine, then his name would be on patent applications and development contracts that she had claimed credit for. If he could prove his involvement in other Meridian innovations, then 15 years of fraud and stolen intellectual property would be exposed to government investigators who took defense contractor misconduct very seriously. The assembled engineers and board members were staring at her now, with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning comprehension. Their loyalties beginning to shift as they processed what they had just witnessed. "Start the engine," Marcus said to Dr. R. Mitchell, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who was absolutely certain of his diagnosis. "It should run perfectly now." The engine fired up on the first attempt, its powerful rumble filling the hangar with the sound of precisely controlled combustion. The diagnostic displays that had shown error codes and fault conditions for 3 weeks now showed green lights across every system. Performance parameters settling into optimal ranges as the engine reached full operational power. Dr. Mitchell stared at her instruments with the expression of someone watching a miracle. While the other engineers began talking excitedly among themselves about the elegance of the solution and the sophistication of the diagnosis, Marcus stood quietly beside the running engine. Its success a vindication not just of his technical knowledge, but of his father's reputation and legacy. Victoria Sterling watched her carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. The theft and fraud that had built her empire suddenly exposed by a 17-year-old boy with grease under his fingernails and his father's work boots. The board members were clustering around Marcus, now asking questions about his background and education. Their earlier mockery replaced by the calculating interest of people who recognized valuable talent. Word of the engine repair was already spreading through the facility, carried by engineers and technicians who had watched the demonstration and understood its significance. Dr. Mitchell was documenting the repair procedure and taking photos of the corrected component installation. Her scientific training overriding any loyalty she might have felt to Victoria Sterling. Within hours, the story would be throughout the aerospace industry. How a teenager had solved a problem that had stumped teams of experts, and how his solution had exposed years of corporate misconduct and stolen intellectual property. Victoria Sterling could see her future unraveling with crystalline clarity. Government investigations, criminal charges, the loss of everything she had built through decades of calculated cruelty and systematic theft. Marcus walked over to where his father, Daniel, stood in the doorway of the hangar. Having been summoned from his janitorial duties by the commotion and the news that his son was somehow involved, Daniel Miller looked older than his 53 years. His shoulders bent by 15 years of manual labor, and his face lined by the stress of supporting a family on minimum wage while watching lesser minds take credit for his innovations. But as he watched his son being congratulated by engineers and executives, his expression showed something that had been absent for years: pride and vindication. "You did good, son," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of all the conversations they had shared over kitchen table schematics and late-night lessons in thermodynamics and material science. Marcus hugged his father, feeling the strength in arms that had been weakened by janitorial work, but never broken by injustice. The federal investigation that followed moved with the efficiency of a system designed to handle defense contractor fraud. Within a week, teams of auditors and criminal investigators had descended on Meridian Aerospace, armed with warrants and subpoenas that gave them access to 15 years of contracts, patents, and financial records. Thomas Miller's original design documents preserved in government archives and patent filings provided incontrovertible evidence of his contributions to technologies that Victoria Sterling had claimed as her own innovations. The stolen intellectual property was worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the fraudulent billing practices had cost taxpayers even more. Victoria Sterling was arrested on charges that would likely result in decades in federal prison. her assets frozen and her reputation destroyed by the same media machinery that had once celebrated her rise to power. Marcus Miller received scholarship offers from every major engineering school in the country. But he chose to stay in Seattle and attend the University of Washington so he could remain close to his father. Thomas Miller was offered his choice of senior engineering positions at aerospace companies across the industry. Opportunities to rebuild the career that had been stolen from him 15 years earlier. He chose to start his own consulting firm specializing in the kind of innovative engine design that had made Meridian Aerospace successful before corruption had poisoned its leadership. The firm's first contract was with the Pentagon, developing next-generation military aircraft engines based on designs that Thomas Miller had been refining in his mind during 15 years of cleaning floors and emptying trash cans. The irony was not lost on him that his greatest professional success would come from knowledge he had gained while working as a janitor in the building where his stolen innovations had made other people rich. The last time Marcus saw Victoria Sterling, she was being led from the courthouse in handcuffs, her silver hair disheveled and her thousand suit wrinkled from a night in federal custody. She looked smaller, somehow diminished by the loss of power and privilege that had defined her identity for so long. Marcus felt no satisfaction in her downfall. Only a quiet sense that justice had finally balanced the scales that had been tilted by greed and arrogance for too many years. He thought about all the other talented people who had been crushed by corporate systems designed to protect mediocrity and reward theft, wondering how many innovations had been buried and how many careers had been destroyed by people like Victoria Sterling. The engine that had started everything continued to run perfectly in Meridian's hangar. Its smooth operation a testament to the power of knowledge, passed from father to son, and the resilience of truth in a world built on lies. As Marcus walked across the University of Washington campus on his first day of classes, he carried with him a worn notebook filled with his father's engineering sketches and calculations. Diagrams that represented not just technical knowledge, but the unbreakable bond between a parent who had lost everything and a child who had helped him reclaim it. The notebook had been his father's companion during 15 years of exile from the work he loved, a repository of innovations and improvements that he had continued to develop even while emptying trash cans and mopping floors. Now it would guide Marcus through his own engineering education. A bridge between the practical knowledge gained in late-night kitchen table lessons and the theoretical understanding he would acquire in lecture halls and laboratories. The future stretched ahead of them, both bright with possibilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier, when they had been nothing more than a janitor and his son in a world that measured worth by job titles and bank account balances.